Hello family, welcome to Stories by Tocci. We bring you interesting folk tales. Please subscribe and drop a like for us. This generosity would go a long way for us. Also share to family and friends. And please turn on post notification to stay tuned for more. Thank you as you do so. Now let's get into the story. The morning in Enugu wore its usual shawl of red dust, fine powder that clung to iron railings and danced lazily in the sunbeams slicing through half-drawn curtains. In a corner of the compound, a hen scratched nervously at the soil, scattering dry leaves that looked like old letters no one wanted to read anymore. Inside the flat, Eleanor moved slowly, her swollen belly pulling her body forward as though she carried not one child, but an entire kingdom within her. The smell of boiling millet porridge wrapped the room, thick and comforting, yet her husband Richard barely noticed. He sat at the dining table in a stiff white shirt, a copy of the Daily Sun spread before him like a shield against conversation. Eleanor hummed faintly, her voice as soft as rain tapping zinc, hoping to lighten the silence that had grown stubborn between them. She adjusted the wrapper tied over her chest, the fabric stretched and worn from constant washing, and placed his breakfast gently on the table. "You should eat before it gets cold," she said, her words landing in the space between them like pebbles thrown into deep water. Richard glanced at her briefly, his eyes sliding over her as though she were part of the furniture, then down at the meal. "You know," he began, his tone half distracted, "you don't always have to dress like a curtain. You could try something more appealing." Eleanor's hands froze at her sides, the steam from the porridge rising between them like smoke from an unseen fire. "I'm carrying our child, Richard," she answered, her voice steady but brittle, as though it might shatter if pushed. Richard took a spoonful of porridge, swallowed, then smirked. "Exactly. You're carrying a child, not a sack of yams. Don't let pregnancy be your excuse to stop looking like a woman." His words fell sharp and cruel, small knives disguised as casual remarks. Eleanor felt them cut, deep and unseen. She turned away, blinking quickly, her hand brushing her belly as if to reassure herself that the life within her was shield enough against the storms outside. Outside, the street vendors called their morning prices, tomatoes, Gary, peppers bright as fire. Life continued, the same Enugu rhythms of bargaining, greetings, and laughter, but inside that room the air grew heavier, weighed down by the invisible wall that was building between a man and the woman who once believed she was the very marrow of his heart. Later that day the sun climbed high, spilling its harsh gold across roofs and streets, melting tar, and making shadows crouch short and sharp at people's feet. Eleanor sat near the window, the curtain drawn slightly to let in light, but not too much heat. She watched children chase a battered football across the road, their shouts rising like birds startled into flight. A Kiki driver leaned against his tricycle, calling out to potential passengers with that practiced, honeyed persuasion that drivers knew best. For a brief moment, Eleanor smiled, wishing she could trap the sound of laughter and pour it into her own quiet rooms. Behind her, Richard moved briskly about, his phone buzzing often with messages that made his face brighten in ways her presence no longer did. He chuckled, typed, paste. Eleanor didn't ask who it was, she already knew. Clara. The name hung in the air of their home like the lingering smoke from a bushfire, acrid and inescapable. Richard had started speaking her name more often, sometimes by accident, sometimes deliberately, until it became a shadow at their table. Eleanor remembered when Richard's laughter was hers, when his words were soft lanterns guiding her through uncertain nights. Now his voice toward her was always edged, always weighing, always comparing her against someone she had never met but could already see in her mind's eye, slim, perfumed, smiling in ways that asked for nothing but took everything. That evening, Richard returned late, smelling faintly of perfume that was not hers. He looked at Eleanor with irritation when she asked if he had eaten. "Don't nag," he snapped, throwing himself onto the sofa. "Clara says women should learn how to stay attractive even after marriage. You should try listening to that." The words stung, but Eleanor only bowed her head, brushing invisible dust from her wrapper. She spoke nothing, but her silence was heavy, like thick harmattan fog settling on the valley. Richard mistook it for surrender, but inside her, a seed of defiance began to grow, watered by humiliation and hardened by the ache of betrayal. She touched her belly again, whispering to the child, "You will be my anchor when the storms rage. You will be the reason I do not drown." Days stretched into weeks, each one carrying the weight of Richard's growing absence. He spent more nights away from home, his excuses thin as morning mist, his eyes always darting toward his buzzing phone, eager for messages from the woman who now owned his laughter. Eleanor moved like a ghost in her own home, cooking meals that went uneaten, folding clothes that remained untouched, waiting for a husband who no longer saw her. Sometimes she stood before the mirror, staring at her changing body, tracing the lines of fatigue under her eyes, the swelling of her ankles, the marks of sacrifice carved by motherhood even before the child arrived. She remembered the girl she had been when she first met Richard, bright, full of songs, quick to laugh. That girl seemed like a relative who had long since traveled far, sending only rare memories as letters. Richard, on the other hand, seemed rejuvenated, as though Clara had breathed new life into him. His jokes returned, but never for her, his attention sharpened, but never in her direction. People in the neighborhood still admired him, the way he carried himself, the shine of his shoes, the easy confidence in his stride. "Fine man," they would say. "Any woman would be lucky." Eleanor heard their words like someone listening to a song she used to love, but could no longer bear. The image of her marriage was bright as enamel to outsiders, but inside, the enamel was cracked, hiding rot that spread quietly beneath. One evening, when Richard dismissed her concerns with a wave of his hand, telling her she was becoming too needy, Eleanor felt something inside her snap, not with noise but with the stillness of a bowstring stretched too far. She turned away, biting her lip to keep tears from falling. She would not give him the satisfaction of her breakdown. Instead, she whispered again to her unborn child, "When they mock me, when they despise me, you will be my answer. You will be my victory." It was a Friday evening when the final blow came, subtle but devastating. Eleanor had prepared okra soup, thick and green, with tender chunks of meat she bought from the butcher after bargaining until her voice was hoarse. She remembered how Richard once loved it, how he used to close his eyes in pleasure as he swallowed. She placed it on the table with quiet hope, a prayer folded into the aroma of Uzziza leaves. Richard glanced at it, then frowned, pushing the bowl away with disdain. "Clara says women who know their worth don't waste time in kitchens trying to buy love with food," he scoffed. Eleanor's hands trembled, the ladle clattering against the pot. She stared at him, searching for a trace of the man she had once loved, but all she saw was someone who looked like Richard yet spoke with another woman's tongue. "Is that what she says?" Eleanor asked, her voice low, trembling like a lantern flame in the wind. Richard shrugged, unbothered, as if he had simply stated a fact about the weather. "Maybe you should listen. You've let yourself go. I didn't marry a tired, shapeless woman." The words tore into her more deeply than she expected, ripping open wounds she had tried to dress with patience. She stood still, her heart hammering so loudly she thought he might hear it. In that moment, she understood with startling clarity. The house she lived in no longer welcomed her, the man she married no longer loved her, and the life she once knew was gone. That night, when Richard turned away to sleep, Eleanor lay awake, staring at the ceiling as shadows crawled across the walls. She touched her belly one more time, whispering, "You are all I have left. You are my light in this long tunnel." And somewhere in the darkness, she knew that the path before her would soon demand more strength than she had ever imagined. The evening crept into Enugu with the slowness of a tired drummer tapping a fading beat, and inside Eleanor's chest there was a hollow rhythm that refused to align with the city's noise. The compound buzzed with neighbors greeting each other, pots clattering, transistor radios humming high-life tunes, and children shouting names across narrow corridors, yet none of it entered the small room where she sat. Richard's words from the night before still echoed, bruising her ears afresh, shapeless, tired curtain sack of yams. Each phrase replayed like a market woman refusing to lower her price, stubborn and insistent. She pressed both palms to her belly, feeling the steady thump of life moving within, as if her unborn child was responding to her storm with kicks of reassurance. Outside, a vendor's bell rang sharply, advertising boiled groundnuts, and for a moment the scent drifted toward her window. Hunger gnawed at her, but her throat was blocked with grief, unable to swallow. She glanced at Richard, sprawled on the sofa with his phone, grinning at the glowing screen, thumbs moving quickly as if composing music only Clara would dance to. Eleanor tried to speak, to pull his eyes away, but her tongue felt heavy, weighted with the futility of too many failed attempts. Instead, she rose, wrapped her shawl around her shoulders, and walked slowly toward the veranda. The air outside kissed her face with a mixture of dust and distant charcoal smoke, carrying whispers of a city that continued its dance, unbothered by her silence. She sat on the cool step, feeling the rough cement under her palms, and tears slipped down her cheeks uninvited. She wiped them quickly, for she had always hated crying where others could see, and murmured into the dimness, "Even if he no longer sees me, God, let me not vanish from myself." It was then she realized that love, when mocked too often, begins to wilt like spinach left too long in the sun, and no amount of water can return its firmness. The following week passed with an unsettling rhythm, each day heavy with Richard's absence and Eleanor's loneliness. He stayed away until deep into the night, returning with the faint scent of foreign perfume clinging to his shirt and a smile that never reached her direction. His laughter had shifted register, reserved only for calls that came in at odd hours, whispers that sent his shoulders shaking. When Eleanor asked if he would accompany her to the clinic for her antenatal checkup, he waved her off, saying he had more pressing business to attend to, though his cologne lingered suspiciously strong for a man who claimed to be buried in files. So she went alone, climbing into a tricycle that rattled over potholes as if announcing her heartache to the world. At the clinic, other women arrived with their husbands, men who carried plastic bags of fruits and malt drinks, their faces glowing with anticipation as though they too carried the pregnancies. Eleanor sat quietly on the wooden bench, folding her arms around herself, trying not to envy the smiles and the tender hands placed protectively on swollen bellies. When her name was called, she rose, and as the nurse took her blood pressure and asked about her meals, she answered softly, hiding the loneliness in her voice. On the way back, she bought beans cake from a woman frying by the roadside, eating it slowly as the tricycle jostled her along, and she promised herself she would not let bitterness take root in her stomach, for it was already busy housing life. That night, when Richard finally returned and grumbled that the house was too quiet, she almost laughed at the irony. A quiet house, yes, but only because he had sucked away the music. Still, she held her tongue, whispering instead into the stillness, "I will not let this silence kill me. I will weave it into a covering for myself and the child." One evening, the quarrel arrived not with shouting, but with the slow drip of contempt that can drown a soul. Eleanor had prepared rice and stew, bright with red palm oil and the sweet sting of fresh pepper, hoping against hope that Richard might taste it and remember what it meant to be loved through food. But he came home carrying a paper bag from a fast food joint, the logo glaring at her like a rival's smirk. He dropped it on the table, pulled out a burger, and began eating without so much as a glance at her pot still simmering on the fire. Eleanor stood frozen, ladle in hand, watching the steam rise and curl like a prayer that had missed heaven's door. "So all my effort is nothing?" she asked finally, her voice low, steady, but brimming with wounded dignity. Richard looked up, chewing lazily. "Clara told me homemade food is overrated. What matters is presentation, class. You wouldn't understand." The sentence was the final strike of a blacksmith's hammer, cracking something that had already been weakened by heat. Eleanor set down the ladle carefully, her fingers trembling. She thought of her mother's words. "A man who despises your cooking is not rejecting the food. He is rejecting the hands that prepared it." She did not argue further, for she knew arguments with Richard were like pouring water into a basket. Nothing stayed. Instead, she walked into the bedroom, sat on the edge of the bed, and rubbed her belly with both hands, whispering fiercely, "You are not overrated. You are my presentation. You are my class. You are the only proof I need." And in that moment, she decided she could no longer wait for him to see her worth. She would have to find it herself. The night she finally chose to leave began like any other. Enugu's sky painted in streaks of pawpaw orange, kiki horns echoing, vendors calling their last prices for roasted plantain. Richard came home later than usual, his shirt half untucked, the smell of expensive perfume preceding him like an announcement. He tossed his keys on the table, barely glancing at her, and collapsed into a chair with a sigh that carried no apology. Eleanor watched him quietly, her heart calm in a way that surprised her. For the first time, she did not feel anger, only clarity, as though her spirit had been waiting for this moment. She rose, walked to the small cupboard, and began folding clothes into a bag, slowly, methodically, each fold a farewell. Richard frowned, finally noticing. "What are you doing?" he demanded, his voice sharper than usual. Eleanor did not answer at once. She placed a wrapper into the bag, then lifted the photograph of their wedding day from the dresser. In it, Richard's smile had been wide, his arm tight around her waist, both of them looking at the camera as if the future owed them joy. She traced the frame with her finger, then set it down. "I am leaving," she said simply, her tone calm, final, like a judge delivering a verdict. Richard barked a laugh, disbelieving. "Where will you go? Who will take you, heavy as you are?" Eleanor zipped the bag, lifted it with surprising strength, and stood tall, her belly leading her like a compass. "I will go where peace lives," she replied. And with that, she walked toward the door, her feet steady, her heart lighter with each step. Outside, the night air welcomed her like an old friend, and the city lights blinked as if winking their approval. She whispered to her child, "We are free now," and the baby kicked in agreement. The night carried her footsteps through the heart of Enugu, each step steady though her belly swayed like a calabash on troubled water. The bag she clutched felt heavier than its contents, for inside it was not just fabric and belongings, but the pieces of a life she could no longer mend. Streetlights flickered uncertainly, some working, others stubbornly dark, leaving patches of shadow along her path. She walked past kiosks where traders were shutting their wooden doors, the smell of roasted maize mingling with the dampness of earth still wet from the afternoon rain. A group of men laughed loudly near a bar, their voices careless and loud, yet she felt invisible among them, her presence wrapped in quiet determination. At a junction, she paused, pressing her hand to her back as a sharp pain shot through her. The child within her shifted, as if to remind her that she was never alone, that she carried a small army in her womb. She whispered into the air, "Patience, my little one. We will find shelter." She remembered her mother's words. "When the road is dark, don't curse the night. Light your own lantern and keep moving." The lantern she carried was faith, and it flickered, small but steady, in her chest. She walked toward Emin, guided not by a map but by instinct, by the certainty that anywhere outside Richard's house would be safer than the battlefield she had left behind. By the time she reached a row of modest apartments with peeling paint and narrow verandas, the sky had grown deeper, and the moon peered out cautiously from behind scattered clouds. A gate creaked as she pushed it open, and a wiry old man, the landlord, appeared, his eyes sharp beneath a cap too big for his head. He looked her up and down, noting her swollen belly and weary stance. "You need a place?" he asked, his voice as gruff as gravel. Eleanor nodded, clutching her bag tighter. "Yes, sir. Just a small room. Anywhere I can lay my head." He studied her for a moment longer, then shrugged. "There is a back room. Small. The roof leaks when rain is angry. But if you can pay, it is yours." Eleanor reached into her wrapper, pulled out the folded notes she had saved secretly over months, and handed them to him. He counted slowly, then unlocked the door and handed her the key. "Sleep," he said. "Morning will find you." And so, Eleanor stepped into her new world, a small, dim room with cracked walls and a floor that smelt faintly of dust and old soap. She dropped her bag, lay carefully on the thin mattress, and pressed her cheek against the pillow. For the first time in months, she felt the air breathe differently. It was not home, not yet, but it was hers, and it carried no insults, no mocking laughter, only the quiet hum of possibility. Morning in Emin woke her with the cry of hawkers and the crowing of stubborn roosters who refused to let anyone forget the sun was climbing. Eleanor sat up slowly, her body aching from the thin mattress, her belly taut with the weight of life readying itself. She listened to the world outside her window, the sharp clink of a woman pounding yam in a mortar, the laughter of children running barefoot to school, the rickety sound of a bicycle wobbling down the road. Life here moved differently, less polished than the neighborhoods Richard had preferred, but more honest, more human. She washed her face in a plastic basin, tied her wrapper, and ventured out to buy bread and akra from a roadside stall. The seller, a middle-aged woman with arms strong as pestles, looked at Eleanor kindly. "First time I'm seeing you here," she said. Eleanor nodded, murmuring thanks as she collected the food wrapped in newspaper. Back in her room, she ate slowly, savoring each bite, her hands resting protectively over her belly. She whispered to her unborn child, "We will grow roots here. They may be small, but they will hold us." That day, she asked around for work, walking from one shop to another, her swollen figure drawing curious stares and occasional pity. Most shook their heads, saying they could not hire a woman so close to delivery. By evening, her feet ached, but she did not despair. She returned to her room and sat by the window, watching the sky fade to purple. She remembered her grandmother's saying, "The river does not refuse stones, yet it still finds its way to the sea." She believed she too would find her way, no matter how many rejections blocked her path. That night, she folded her wrapper neatly, lay back on her mattress, and spoke softly into the shadows. "Tomorrow will not mock me. Tomorrow will remember my name." She drifted into sleep with the sound of distant drums beating faintly through the neighborhood, their rhythm weaving into her dreams. Days melted into weeks, and Eleanor's belly grew heavier, carrying within it not just life but the weight of her loneliness. The nights were hardest, when the compound fell into silence except for the croaking of frogs and the occasional cry of a baby in another room. She often sat awake, her hand on her stomach, whispering lullabies she had learned as a child in her mother's kitchen, her voice soft and tender as though her unborn baby already understood. She began to earn small coins washing dishes at a canteen owned by a widow named Ngozi, whose face was lined by hardship but softened by kindness. "You remind me of myself when I was younger," Ngozi said, pressing a plate of rice into Eleanor's hands one evening after work. Eleanor smiled faintly, her eyes damp with gratitude. It was not much, but it was enough to remind her that the world still had corners of kindness. The canteen was small, noisy, and always filled with the smell of fried fish and spices. Eleanor worked quietly, wiping tables, fetching water, serving customers with a bowed head. She did not mind the work, it was honest, and each coin earned was a seed she could plant for the future. As her delivery approached, her body grew more restless, pains shooting across her back like bolts of lightning. She feared the day would come, and she would be alone, but fate had prepared her an unlikely companion. Ngozi introduced her to Sarah, a midwife who lived nearby, and often helped women deliver when hospitals were too far or too expensive. Sarah's eyes were gentle, her words like cool water poured over a fever. "Don't worry," she assured Eleanor. "When the time comes, I will be there. You will not walk this road alone." Eleanor clutched her hand tightly, relief flooding her heart. That night, she returned to her room and fell to her knees, praying into the dusty floor, thanking God for sending help wrapped in the face of a stranger. The night of birth arrived with a sky swollen with thunderclouds. Rain drummed the zinc roofs like impatient fingers, and lightning tore across the heavens, turning night into sudden flashes of day. Eleanor's pains began sharp and insistent, rolling through her body like waves determined to break the shore. She screamed, her voice muffled by the storm outside, but her cry reached Ngozi, who rushed to fetch Sarah. The midwife arrived quickly, her presence steady as a tree in the wind. "Breathe, my dear, breathe. The river knows its course," she murmured, wiping Eleanor's sweat-soaked brow. Hours stretched long, each minute heavy with agony, but Eleanor clung to Sarah's instructions, holding tightly to her words as if they were ropes keeping her from drowning. Finally, with a cry louder than the rain itself, the first baby slid into the world, small and slippery, his wail piercing the storm. Eleanor wept, both from pain and wonder. Before she could gather her breath, another wave of pain gripped her, and a second child followed, then, to everyone's astonishment, a third, his cry bold and insistent as though announcing himself to the universe. Eleanor stared, tears mingling with sweat, her body trembling with exhaustion. "Triplets?" she gasped, her voice breaking into laughter and sobs at once. Sarah nodded, her face glowing. "God must have used both hands with you." Eleanor gathered the three tiny bodies against her chest, her heart swelling with awe. She named them Grace, Hope, and Victor, names that were not mere sounds but living prayers. Grace for the mercy that carried her this far, Hope for the light she clung to in her darkest nights, and Victor for the victory of survival over despair. Outside, the storm began to quiet, as though even the heavens paused to acknowledge the miracle that had unfolded in the small leaking room. Eleanor closed her eyes, holding her children close, and whispered through trembling lips, "We are no longer broken. We are complete." Richard's mornings in Enugu had begun to take on the texture of silk, smooth on the surface, yet fragile if pulled the wrong way. On the outside, he looked like a man who had conquered life. He drove his new car with pride, wore neatly pressed shirts that smelled faintly of imported cologne, and carried himself with the swagger of someone who believed the city itself bowed whenever his shoes touched the pavement. Neighbors still greeted him with admiration, vendors waved at him in the mornings, and colleagues at work nodded with respect when he passed. To the world, he was the picture of success. Yet behind his polished smile, a hollowness gnawed at him, like termites chewing quietly at the legs of a strong wooden chair. Clara, the woman he had traded his marriage for, was beautiful. Her laughter sparkled like glass, her dresses hugged her body with deliberate perfection, and her eyes shone with the hunger of someone always wanting more. At first, Richard had basked in her attention, flattered by the way she touched his arm in public, proud of how heads turned when she walked beside him. But soon, he began to notice the cracks. Clara was not gentle like Eleanor. She had no patience for quiet nights or the simplicity of home-cooked meals. She thrived on noise, on being seen, on expensive outings where everyone could admire her. Richard followed her willingly at first, enjoying the glamour, but after a while the shine began to hurt his eyes. He would come home after an evening at the club, where music blared until his ears rang, and he would long for the soft hum Eleanor used to make when she cooked in their kitchen. He would eat a plate of jollof rice at a restaurant and secretly remember the taste of Eleanor's okra soup, thick and comforting, made not for show but for love. But pride is a dangerous companion. It whispers that apologies are chains, that admitting regret is weakness. So Richard never spoke of his longing. Instead, he laughed louder, spent more, and tried to convince himself that he had made the right choice, even as the emptiness in his chest grew heavier each day. Clara, on her part, was not one to be satisfied with half measures. She demanded attention like a queen who believed the kingdom existed for her delight. She wanted new clothes, expensive perfumes, and trips to places where the lights never dimmed. She criticized Richard's choices, scolded him when he tried to cut back on expenses, and reminded him often that she had given up better offers to be with him. Her words, sweet as honey in public, turned sharp as pepper in private. Richard found himself trapped between her beauty and her barbed tongue, unwilling to admit that the bed he had made for himself was now a bed of thorns. Sometimes, late at night, Clara would catch him staring into space and ask what he was thinking. He would shrug, lie, and say he was planning for the future, but in truth, he was haunted by flashes of Eleanor. Her quiet dignity, her patience, the way she once looked at him as though he were the center of her world. He had not seen her since she left, though the memory of her departure still pricked him. He remembered the calmness in her voice when she told him she was leaving, the way her words carried no desperation, only resolve. It unsettled him, for he had expected tears, begging, perhaps even anger, but she had given him none of those. She had walked out with the strength of someone who carried more than herself, and that image sometimes came to him in dreams. In those dreams, she stood holding a lantern while he stumbled in the dark, trying to catch up. He would wake up sweating, only to find Clara asleep beside him, her perfume heavy and suffocating, reminding him that dreams were safer than reality. The emptiness grew louder, but Richard smothered it with more parties, more laughter, and more plans to prove to the world that he had chosen the better path. Months passed, and with them came whispers that Eleanor had been seen around Emin, carrying her swollen belly with dignity, working quietly at a small canteen. Richard dismissed the rumors when they reached him, waving them away as idle gossip. He told himself she would be struggling, that she had surely grown haggard without his support, that she must have regretted leaving. Yet a small part of him feared otherwise. Sometimes he imagined walking into town and seeing her again, imagined her eyes meeting his with bitterness or perhaps forgiveness. The thought unsettled him more than Clara's demands ever did. He drowned those feelings by indulging Clara's greatest wish, a wedding grand enough to make the city talk for months. Clara had grown restless, insisting that their relationship meant little without the stamp of marriage. People are beginning to wonder, she told him one night, her voice sharp as broken glass. They think I'm wasting my time on you. If you want me, show them. If you don't, I can still leave. Her threat was thinly veiled, but it worked. Richard could not bear the thought of losing face. He had already risked too much to keep Clara. So he promised her the biggest wedding Enugu had seen in years. He began making plans, booking a cathedral, hiring caterers, sending out invitations embossed with golden letters. He enjoyed the admiration that followed, the congratulatory handshakes, the envy in the eyes of men who wished they were him. Yet at night, when silence finally caught him, he sometimes wondered if the applause he sought could fill the emptiness that grew larger each day inside his chest. He never admitted it, not even to himself, but he felt like a man building a mansion on sand. When the invitations were printed, Richard made a decision that surprised even him. He sent one to Eleanor. Perhaps it was pride, perhaps a cruel desire to show her what she had lost, or perhaps, though he would never admit it, a deep longing to see her face again. He imagined her shrinking when she received it, imagined her weeping in regret, imagined her hiding away, too ashamed to face the world. The thought made him smirk, gave him a sense of victory that tasted sweet on his tongue. Let her see what real happiness looks like, he muttered to himself as he sealed the envelope. He told Clara about it, expecting her to laugh with him, but her reaction was sharper. Why invite her? She asked suspiciously, her eyes narrowing like a cat ready to pounce. Richard shrugged, hiding his true motives. Because I want her to know I've moved on. Because I want her to witness what she could never give me. Clara said nothing more, but her silence carried unease, and Richard ignored it, convincing himself he had done the right thing. The invitations went out across Enugu, and the city buzzed with talk of the upcoming ceremony. Tailors stitched gowns, photographers polished their lenses, and caterers counted plates, all preparing for the day when Richard would stand at the altar beside his glittering bride. To him, it was proof that he had won, that he had built a new life brighter than the old. What he did not know was that life, with its sly humor and unpredictable turns, was already preparing a stage on which his pride would falter, his confidence would crack, and the very woman he thought broken would return, not in shame but in glory. The morning of the wedding broke with a sky that seemed to have been freshly polished, its blue stretching wide above Enugu like an endless piece of fine cloth laid out for a festival. The streets bustled with energy. Women in bright wrappers hurried to the market for last-minute items, tailors pressed gowns with sizzling irons, and children darted between feet, excited by the commotion of an event bigger than their understanding. The cathedral, tall and imposing with its stained-glass windows catching the sun like fragments of rainbow, stood ready to welcome the hundreds who had been invited. Outside, canopies had been erected, their white fabric flapping lightly in the morning breeze, while cooks in aprons stirred giant pots of jollof rice, the aroma promising a feast to come. Cars began arriving early, sleek and polished, horns honking as drivers jostled for space. Inside one of those vehicles, Clara adjusted her dress, her fingers twitching nervously despite her practiced smile. She was stunning in white lace, every bead on her gown catching the light like dew on morning grass. Richard sat beside her, proud and confident, his suit immaculate, his smile wide, as though the entire city had come to celebrate him alone. He nodded at passers-by, relishing their admiring stares, basking in the applause before the vows had even been spoken. Yet somewhere deep in his chest, a small unease flickered like a candle trying to survive a gust of wind. He shook it off quickly, telling himself this was Victory Day, the day Eleanor would be forgotten, the day Clara would cement her throne at his side. Inside the cathedral, guests took their seats, their voices weaving together in a chorus of excitement, speculation, and gossip. The organist began to play softly, filling the high-ceilinged hall with notes that trembled like birds learning to fly. It was into this carefully staged scene of joy and spectacle that a long, sleek black limousine rolled slowly up the road, its polished body reflecting the sun so brightly that heads turned instinctively. Conversations faltered, eyes widened, and whispers began to ripple through the crowd like waves disturbed by a hidden stone. The limousine came to a stop directly outside the cathedral steps, and for a moment it simply idled, the door shut, its windows dark, teasing the crowd with the suspense of who might emerge. "Who is that?" voices murmured. "Is it a government official? Some dignitary?" Even the vendors selling puff puff and sachet water craned their necks, eager to witness the arrival. Then, with a slow elegance, the back door opened, and a figure stepped out, Eleanor. She was dressed simply, but with a dignity that made her glow brighter than jewels. Her gown was modest, soft cream in color, flowing around her in folds that swayed gently with each step. Her hair was neatly tied back, her face calm, her eyes holding the kind of quiet strength that silenced onlookers without a word. In her arms, she carried not one but 3 tiny bundles, swaddled in cloths of blue and yellow, their small faces peeking curiously at the world. A gasp rose from the crowd, sharp and collective, like air sucked out of the room. "Triplets," someone whispered, and the word spread quickly, passed from mouth to mouth, until it became the only sound that filled the air. Eleanor did not rush. She walked with deliberate grace, her steps measured, her back straight, her head high. The sun caught her in that moment, bathing her in light, and she looked less like a scorned woman returning in shame, and more like a queen arriving with her heirs. Children stopped playing to stare. Women nudged one another, their eyes widening in admiration. Men shook their heads slowly, unable to hide their awe. The whispers grew, turning to murmurs of respect. "She looks radiant. She carries herself well. See how blessed she is." Eleanor's heart pounded beneath her calm exterior, but she did not falter. She held her children close, each one a living testimony of resilience, each one a silent announcement of her triumph over betrayal. As she reached the steps, she paused briefly, allowing the crowd's eyes to rest fully on her, then continued into the cathedral, her presence pulling silence into the vast hall as effectively as if the organ had ceased to play. Inside the cathedral, Richard froze mid-laugh as he saw her enter. For a moment, his mind could not process what his eyes were showing him. The Eleanor he remembered had left broken, silent, pregnant but fragile. The Eleanor walking into the church was transformed, her beauty sharpened not by jewels or perfumes, but by the glow of survival and the unshakable aura of motherhood. His smile slipped, faltered, then vanished entirely, leaving his face pale and exposed. Clara, standing beside him at the altar, noticed his reaction before she even saw Eleanor. She followed his gaze, and when her eyes landed on the sight of the woman holding 3 infants, her lips parted slightly in shock. A hush fell over the entire congregation. Even the officiating priest paused, his prepared sermon momentarily forgotten. Eleanor walked calmly down the aisle, her children in her arms, the swaddled triplets cooing softly as though the cathedral had been built just for their entrance. The crowd turned to watch her progress, the sound of her footsteps echoing through the hall in the silence. Richard's chest tightened, his throat felt dry, his thoughts scattered. He wanted to look away, but found himself trapped by her presence. She did not glance at him, did not falter under the weight of hundreds of eyes. Instead, she moved with composure, taking a seat near the front, her children now cradled gently as she adjusted the cloth around them. Murmurs spread again, softer this time, respectful, awed. She looked stronger than before. God blessed her abundantly. See how fortune turns tables. Clara's jaw tightened, her fingers clenching the bouquet she held. She leaned slightly toward Richard and whispered through gritted teeth, "You invited her, didn't you?" Richard said nothing, his mind too clouded with shock, his heart pounding as if trying to escape his chest. For the first time in months, he felt small, diminished in the presence of the woman he had once mocked. Eleanor had not returned in shame, as he had hoped, but in strength, and the contrast cut him deeper than any insult ever could. The service began, but the focus of the room was no longer on Clara's sparkling gown or Richard's polished smile. It was on the quiet figure seated with 3 miracles in her arms. Every hymn sung seemed to circle around her, every prayer seemed to echo her survival. Richard tried to concentrate, to reclaim the moment, but he found himself glancing again and again at Eleanor, each look tightening the knot in his chest. Clara, sensing his distraction, grew restless. She shifted, coughed, adjusted her veil, her discomfort obvious. When the priest asked the congregation if anyone objected to the union, the silence was thick, heavy, not because no one had words, but because all eyes had already declared their judgment. No one spoke aloud, yet the truth was written clearly in every glance, every whisper, every subtle shake of the head. Richard had traded treasure for trinkets, diamonds for glass. Eleanor sat calmly, not raising her voice, not making any accusation. She did not need to. Her children spoke louder than any words could, their very existence silencing doubts, erasing the image of her as a discarded wife. When she rose briefly to adjust one child, the light from the stained glass window fell directly on her, bathing her in a kaleidoscope of colors. It looked to many like heaven itself had chosen to place its hand upon her. Richard felt sweat gathering at his temples, his mouth dry, his heart pounding with the realization that the victory he thought he had built was slipping through his fingers like sand. Clara's eyes burned with fury, her smile brittle, her pride shaken before the congregation. And as Eleanor sat again, calm and collected, the unspoken truth settled into the room. She had not come to fight, not come to disrupt, but simply to exist, and her very existence was a declaration that she had already won. The cathedral air grew heavy, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. The priest's words tumbled into silence, swallowed by the weight of what had just unfolded. Guests shifted uneasily in their seats, their eyes darting between the bride in white lace and the quiet figure who had entered with her 3 infants, a living reminder of truths long buried. Richard's fingers twitched at his side, his chest rising and falling with shallow breaths. His once practiced smile had deserted him, leaving behind a face raw with disbelief. He wanted to speak, to reclaim the moment, but no words came. It was as though his tongue had forgotten its craft, the same tongue that once charmed crowds, wooed Eleanor, and seduced Clara, now sitting heavy in his mouth, useless. Clara's bouquet trembled in her grip, petals shedding onto the marble floor, each one falling like a fragment of her composure. She glared at Richard, her eyes sharp enough to cut, silently demanding an explanation that he had no strength to give. Eleanor, meanwhile, adjusted her children's swaddles with the calm precision of someone who knew the power of silence. Her triplets whimpered softly, small sounds that echoed louder than the choir's hymns, louder than the priest's prayers, louder than all of Enugu's gossip combined. The congregation could feel it, the shift in the air, the way the day no longer belonged to Richard or Clara, but to the woman who had been cast aside and had returned carrying miracles in her arms. A murmur rose, subdued but unrelenting. God vindicates the patient. The rain does not fall forever. See how the stone rejected by the builder has become the cornerstone. Each phrase moved like wind through dry leaves, stirring the hall until even the priest lowered his gaze, unsure of how to proceed. Richard's heart pounded in his ears, sweat running down the back of his neck, the realization dawning with painful clarity that this day he had imagined as his greatest triumph had instead become his public undoing. Clara's composure, stretched thin by envy and humiliation, finally snapped. She leaned toward Richard, her voice low but sharp, slicing through the thick silence. "You said she would not matter. You said she would vanish." Her words were not a question but an accusation, a dagger aimed at his already wounded pride. Richard opened his mouth to respond, but his voice cracked, only a stammer emerging. The congregation watched, many with pity, some with scorn, as the man who had once strutted with the pride of a peacock now fumbled like a bird caught in its own feathers. Clara's eyes blazed. She tossed the bouquet onto the altar steps, its bright colors now mocking her, a reminder of the ceremony that had unraveled before it could even reach its vows. She turned to the priest, her chin lifted in defiance. "I will not marry a man who cannot let go of his past," she declared. Gasps echoed through the cathedral, but her words carried the ring of finality. With deliberate steps, she lifted her veil, untied the lace train dragging behind her, and walked down the aisle, her heels striking the marble like drumbeats of war. The crowd parted for her, some whispering, some shaking their heads, but she did not look back. Richard remained frozen at the altar, his mouth open, his heart sinking, his pride shattered. He turned his gaze, almost unwillingly, toward Eleanor, and their eyes met for the first time in months. Hers were calm, unflinching, carrying no malice, only the weight of someone who had walked through fire and come out whole. Richard felt his knees weaken. In that single gaze, he understood what he had thrown away, what he had mocked, what he had despised. It was like watching gold slip through his fingers while clutching tightly at dust. The silence that followed was not the comfortable kind shared among loved ones, but the suffocating silence of shame. The priest cleared his throat, searching for words, but the weight of the moment pressed him down, making speech impossible. Guests began to rise, some leaving in awkward haste, others lingering to watch the wreckage of pride unfold. Richard stumbled down from the altar, his steps uneven, and approached Eleanor, desperation clinging to him like sweat. "Eleanor," he whispered, his voice cracked and trembling, "please let me explain." She shifted her gaze back to her children, rocking them gently, her lips moving in a quiet lullaby meant for them alone. He reached out a trembling hand, as if to touch Victor's tiny fist, but she drew back, not harshly, not angrily, but firmly, like a gate that knows who it will not admit. "There is nothing to explain," she said softly, her words carrying the strength of a river that had carved valleys through stone. "The time for explanations is gone." Her voice was steady, her tone final, yet there was no bitterness in it, only truth. Richard's hand dropped to his side, his shoulders slumping under the weight of regret. He looked at the triplets again, seeing pieces of himself in their faces, the shape of a nose, the curl of hair, the stubborn set of a tiny jaw. The realization stabbed deeper. They were his blood, his legacy, yet they would grow up without calling him father. Tears gathered in his eyes, but they were too late, falling like rain on parched ground long after the crops had withered. Eleanor rose, her children cradled securely, and began to walk out, her back straight, her steps unhurried, her dignity intact. Each footstep echoed like a drumbeat of triumph, a reminder that survival itself can be the loudest revenge. Outside, the afternoon sun was blazing, casting long shadows on the cathedral steps. The limousine still waited, its polished body gleaming like a sentinel of fate. The crowd that had spilled out after her watched in hushed awe as Eleanor descended slowly, her triplets nestled against her chest, their small breaths mingling with hers. Some women clapped quietly, others murmured blessings, while men shook their heads in wonder. She reached the car, and the driver hurried to open the door, bowing slightly as though she were royalty. She settled the children inside, adjusted their swaddles, and then turned once, her eyes sweeping over the cathedral, not in bitterness but in farewell. Richard had followed her out, but he stood rooted at the top of the steps, unable to descend, the distance between them now wider than any road in Enugu. Clara was gone, the guests were dispersing, and he was left with nothing but the hollow echo of his own choices. Eleanor's gaze passed over him briefly, not lingering, not condemning, simply acknowledging the man he had become. Then she stepped into the limousine, and the door closed with a quiet finality. The engine purred, the car pulled away, and the city seemed to pause for a heartbeat, as if acknowledging the departure of someone who had walked through humiliation and returned crowned with resilience. As the limousine disappeared into the golden dust of the road, Richard sank to the steps, burying his face in his hands. His suit, once immaculate, now clung to him like a costume stripped of meaning. He realized too late that the applause he had sought was worthless, that true triumph is not in wealth or show, but in dignity that refuses to bow. Eleanor, inside the car, leaned back against the seat, her children nestled safely in her arms. She smiled faintly, not because she had won over Richard, but because she had won over despair. The road ahead was still uncertain, but she knew she carried enough light to walk it, 3 lanterns burning brightly at her side, guiding her into a future no betrayal could darken. Life can bend you, but it should never break you. Sometimes the people you trust the most may mock you, reject you, or even walk away when you need them most. But remember this: your value is not decided by who walks out of your life. Your value is decided by the strength God has already placed inside you. Just like Eleanor, you may pass through nights of tears, but morning will always come with its light. Never forget, rejection is not the end. Sometimes it is only the beginning of a greater glory waiting to be revealed. May your tears never be wasted. May every insult spoken against you turn into a testimony of victory. Where people mock you, may God lift you higher. Where doors close in your face, may new gates of honor open wide for you. May your enemies live long enough to see you laugh last, and may your life shine so brightly that no darkness can cover it. From today onward, may your home know peace, may your hands never be empty, and may joy never depart from your household. In the mighty name of Jesus, somebody say a big amen. Hope you enjoyed this interesting story. Please don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our YouTube channel. Turn on post notifications. See you on our next story.